What exactly is your own personal criteria for an all-time great? I don't think there's an answer out there that gets unanimous approval, but through this series, I want to help in outlining the argument for 7 different fighters as MMA's undisputed GOAT. Anderson Silva, Khabib Nurmagomedov, Amanda Nunes, George St-Pierre, Fedor Emelianenko, Demetrious Johnson, and John Jones. I won't try to deny it. These 7 fighters are not all on the same level, but each certainly has something that has established them as a cut above all others, within their respective divisions and eras. Everything else is a matter of preference. Week by week, I'll take one of these fighters, breaking down their unique claim to the throne, dropping some insight on where that claim might be hindered, before leaving the actual decision making up to you guys. I think it'll be an interesting and enjoyable dip into one of the sport's most ever-present topics, and between myself and you guys, our loyal viewers, we're gonna try and get as close as possible to finding MMA's GOAT. If I've noticed a pattern with this series so far, as I begin to express my thoughts at the beginning of each video, it's that I always find myself starting my arguments with a quick look at what I'm learning about the overall question as a whole, musing over what the hell it is that I'm actually trying to establish here. As I said before, I will rank my picks once the series is through, but if I have learned anything after 4 episodes, it's that these fighters are all special in their own regard, each bringing a unique and interesting argument to the table that supports their inclusion. Anderson achieved, sustained, and was always capable of producing the type of magic that made fans of neophytes, reminding us all frequently of why we love the sport. Khabib reached new levels of dominance that were unheard of, unmatched, utilizing a fighting style that was entirely his own, designed specifically to sap will, to break spirit. And Amanda Nunes took her competition, beating them all at their own games with a level of flair that placed so much distance between herself and her rivals that there is literally no conversation to be had as to who the women's GOAT is. So as we look at the subject of this 4th entry to the series, George St-Pierre, the main question that I have is, what is George's angle? I think out of all of the fighters who make up this series, St-Pierre's claim at being the single greatest fighter in the history of mixed martial arts comes with the fewest asterisks, with the least cons to his argument. Debuting in the UFC in 2004 and competing for the next 9 years on a regular basis, if you wanted to put out a manual on how to do this whole thing right, on how to really etch out and define a watertight GOAT argument, you would certainly do it somewhat similarly to GSP, obviously with a few exceptions. He ruled that welterweight division with an air of superiority that is rare, even among dominant fighters. Indeed, his heavy wrestling and top game approach is an effective means of managing risk and ensuring that you can stack the odds in your favor, something that, by contrast, makes the long run of victories turned in by Anderson Silva that bit more impressive. But GSP's major strengths come from how he adapted his game over the years, how he learned from his shortcomings, and eventually devised a skill set that would ensure that he would get his hand raised with as little resistance as possible. Like Khabib, his takedown threat, that blast double leg, was more of an inevitability than anything else. And as I went back and watched St-Pierre's career in chronological order, seeing the improvements he made fight by fight, as the challenges before him became increasingly more difficult, how his athleticism and incredible work ethic allowed him to go from being soundly beaten by Matt Hughes in his first shot at UFC Gold, to then out-wrestling guys like Hughes, like Josh Koscheck, like John Fitch. The fact that he did this all without a conventional background in wrestling, picking up things as he went along rather than coming directly from a NCAA Division I program. Yeah, the main takeaway I had from revisiting George St-Pierre's career as a whole is what a natural this guy was, and what a born winner he would prove himself to be. Because as Matt Hughes swiftly transitioned over to that armbar to finish in his first meeting with St-Pierre in the opening round, as Matt Serra then swarmed on the Canadian to record one of the biggest upsets in the history of the sport, these were the moments that proved to be the making of the man. And over the course of his 28-fight career, the 2 losses that George sustained, he would go on to avenge in truly dominant fashion. A fashion so dominant that you'd wonder how he lost in the first place. He fought the best of the best in what was a stacked welterweight division, defeating the remainder of the era that preceded him, before then doing the same with his contemporaries and then some of the rising talents that would follow. He had that unbeatable aura to the same extent as the likes of John Jones, like a prime Jose Aldo, or the best years of Anderson Silva, like this was the champion of the division, and anything other than a dominant win against the next contender would be a shock. His fight IQ was legendary, his striking extremely strong in its function, Look, he wasn't a knockout artist, but his jab was a weapon that was as effective as any singular strike of that era. His cardio was also incredible, a testament to the type of athlete and workhorse that he was. And though he wasn't a massive finisher during his time at 170 pounds, if your criteria for GOAT status involves technical excellence, dominance over a long drawn-out period of time against a conveyor belt of high-level contenders, while minimizing every opponent's chance of winning, George St-Pierre is likely going to be your pick. He never popped for PEDs also, which I know is a big thing for some of you. And during the 6 or 7 years he spent as the top dog within the welterweight division, he adapted his game, improving on himself so he could contend with the guys who came up through the sport with the singular purpose of dethroning GSP. And that's definitely the hard thing about being a long-time champion, about sustaining a run of excellence while the target is on your back, while you're drawing power as a superstar, and the burden of everything that life carries with it grows heavier and heavier. In terms of his cons, indeed he was a boring fighter at certain points of his career, or at the very least he took the route of dominance, or the path of least resistance too often to be MMA's defining hero to the fans. But George St-Pierre is no Anderson Silva, and had he opted to go down a route that was more geared towards thrilling the crowd, towards filling out his highlight reel, we likely wouldn't be discussing him within this context. GSP did exactly what he had to do to ensure that he won, and that he won consistently. And though his razor-thin and extremely controversial final matchup against the once great Johnny Hendricks was a bit of a sour note to end on, his return 3.5 years later in Madison Square Garden only served to further prove his greatness. As his grappling coach John Danaher once pointed out, if you could level 3 criticisms towards GSP during his best years, they were that he didn't finish fights, he never moved up in weight, and he was so fixated on control that his approach could have been seen as boring. Ahead of UFC 217, George had by all accounts gone through a horrible training camp, filled with illnesses that would later derail any subsequent return. But this newly bulked up figure decided to address his criticisms head on, shaking off 3.5 years of ring rust to take on Michael Bisping for the middleweight title. And on that night, he came in there looking to put on a show, not simply resorting to the takedown that had brought him so much success all those years ago. He fired off spinning attacks, he threw big shots, and he put it on the count in a way that showed him looking to truly make a statement. And though fatigue set in, as his body suffered through this added mass and Bisping's own excellent durability, George was forced to dig deep to eventually take back the momentum. And when the finish came, it came after a brutal barrage, a sequence far removed from the more cautious fighter of old. And in just one fight, GSP had managed to beat an opponent, although certainly not the greatest middleweight in the world, but a very credible opponent nonetheless, doing so up in weight at 185 pounds, earning himself a spot among the sport's 2-weight world champions in the process. Huge wins over Bisping, over Matt Hughes, over Josh Koscheck, Carlos Condit, Nick Diaz, BJ Penn, Matt Serra, Dan Hardy, Sean Shirk, Caro Parisian, John Fitch, Jake Shields, Johnny Hendricks, Thiago Alves. He avenged both of his career losses in stunning fashion. He was a 3-time UFC champion across 2 different weight divisions. And he did this all over the course of 9 years at welterweight, before one final matchup to mark 13 years since his debut. That's a resume that might only be equaled by 1 or at the most 2 fighters within this series. So again, this depends on exactly what you're looking for from your GOAT candidate. Do things like consistency, level of opposition, and making a priority of establishing a gargantuan technical gulf between yourself and your contemporaries outweigh an ability to finish fights, a desire to take risks, and through that, put on exciting matchups, and perhaps a comfort within one's natural division? Because GSP's resume, his overall legacy, is so watertight that the only criticisms you can really level at him come down to your enjoyment of his fights as an entertainment product, or at least most of the criticisms do. Sure, he might have been beaten by Johnny Hendricks depending on how you watch that fight. He got kicked in the head by Carlos Condit, and he got mopped up by Matt Serra of all people. But when it comes to George St-Pierre, it's only the most minor of moments that can really be pointed to as weaknesses within his GOAT claim. Where that leaves him within your list is up to you, I suppose. So yeah, where does this legendary welterweight champion fall within your own personal GOAT list? Do let us know your opinions in the comments section below. We're still in the earliest stages of this series and the response has been pretty great so far, so do be sure to leave a like before subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. Episodes 1, 2 and 3 have already landed, episodes which focus on Anderson Silva, Khabib Nurmagomedov and Amanda Nunes respectively, so be sure to check them out if you haven't already to get a real sense of how each of the varying arguments stack up against one another. Subscribing to the channel will also ensure that you won't miss out on any of the upcoming episodes or the rest of our weekly content. Thank you for watching.